In this video, we're going to talk about the bar gauge configuration and some of the new features that have been added in the RME table. So first we're going to start with a column per pattern table, I believe is what this is. And let's take a look at the configs that we got here. Okay, yeah, so this is set up as a column per pattern. Right now, just a regular table. But let's go ahead and add some bar gauges to it. So if you didn't know, the display option in the column patterns allows you to choose different types of bar gauges. All of this was pretty much taken directly from Zabbix, so you should be familiar with some of the terms here. I'm not going to go into a discussion about how to set up thresholds and things like that. So I'm just going to choose bar. This is just best practice and really depends on the type of metrics that you're talking about using this for. In the case of this network switch data, bits received, I'm always going to set it to be zero-based and I'm going to let the max be calculated. That's a pretty common configuration that I use across all of the deployments that I support. Do that for the second one, bits sent. Output discards, same thing, we'll do it zero-based. Now the last one where it doesn't make sense to set the max to be calculated would be the status. And the status is actually, it's a numeric value, so I'm going to change this other field that we're not going to talk about in this video, but we'll talk about in some other video. So for the bar, I'm going to set it to 0 and 1. And the reason for that is if you know what the range is for the metric value, so think about like CPU percentage, memory percentage, it's always going to be on a 0 to 100% scale. For something like a status, 0 and 1 of them means up, the other means down. So we already know what the ranges are. It's best to just set them to static values. Okay, so now we should have a table here with some bar gauges that are filled in. And the first thing I want to talk about is, so this is like what you get out of the box. This is what it looks like. Now, in the main configuration form, when you click on the settings in the panel and bring up this main configuration form, I'm going to make sure you can see it. All right, so there's these two options below the item patterns, and it's bar gauge layout and bar gauge tooltip. So what bar gauge layout means is how do we set up the proportions relative to other metrics in the table? Do we want to look at the proportions by the table row, so horizontally, or the table column? Right now it's set to table column. So what you see here is one of the values in each one of these columns. So for bits sent, which is the fourth column in, the maximum value, and we can sort the table to figure this out pretty quickly just by clicking on the header, is 4.97 gigabits per second. And I set the max to be calculated. So this is the max. This bar gauge is going to be completely full as a result. That's how that works. All the other values are going to shade the bar gauge relative to the max value for that column. That's what bar gauge layout column means. Bar gauge tooltip is something new, and there is a max value that we can set here, but this is how things natively work outside the box with Zabbix. It's always going to be relative to the max value, whether that's calculated or a static value. Okay, so bar gauge layout column. Hopefully that's well understood. Now for bar gauge tooltip, we're going to skip bar gauge layout row just for a second. But for bar gauge tooltip, there are three options here. So out of the box by default from the Zabbix company, this is not a configuration that you see in any other Zabbix widget. And in fact, if you use the top items widget or the top hosts widget, I'm going to select the none option here for bar gauge tooltip. If you hover over a bar gauge, and I realize my cursor does not show up in these videos. I'm still trying to figure out why that is. If anybody knows how to fix that in OBS Studio, please let me know. Okay, so I'm hovering over. You can kind of see where my cursor is inside the table rows. Right now I'm over the output discards sum column, and I'm just hovering over different bar gauges. And that's how things normally work inside Zabbix. Nothing happens, there's no tooltip or anything like that. If I set the bar gauge tooltip inside the configuration form to max, now what you're going to see when you hover over a bar gauge is this little tooltip that pops up. Okay, so in this configuration, the bar gauges are shaded relative to the max value of the column, each column. Okay, so the max value, and I'm going to sort bits sent again descendingly. The max value is at the top now, and it is set to 100% of the column max because it is the maximum value. So this bar gauge is fully shaded, and that's what the tooltip is telling us. But one of the things that I really like, and I think a lot of people always ask the question, is like, what percentage of this is that? What percentage of X is Y? So it's actually a really nice feature to take all of these interfaces, and our bottom interface, I can see it's 3.99 gigabits per second, but how much percentage is that of the max? Well, I don't know. I would have to take out a calculator, I would have to plug in some numbers. It would probably, it's not going to take you that long, maybe 30 seconds to figure out the value, but I've decided to add that into the table in a way that does not disrupt the normal behavior of the table. And we do that by hovering over the bar gauge, and now you can see it shows us what percentage this value is that I've highlighted of the max value of the column. And that's exactly what the tooltip says. So for the value on the bottom, for bits sent, 3.99 gigabits per second, if I hover over the bar gauge, it is 80.310% of the column max. So now you don't have to do any math. And you can go into the next one, and it pops up in about 100 milliseconds is how the delay is set. So you can scroll through relatively quickly and not see any bar gauge tooltip at all, but if you stop just for just a fraction of a second, it pops up. So I really like this feature. This is super useful for a lot of different use cases. So I really hope you enjoy this particular feature. But let's talk about a few other parts of this feature, and that is bar gauge tooltip sum. So again, talking about the bit sent column, we have 10 rows in here, and each bar gauge is shaded relative to the max of the column. But if we chose sum instead of max in bar gauge tooltip, it's going to change the way the shading works. So now what we're doing is we are showing of the total sum of the entire column what proportion each table cell makes up of the sum. And to make this maybe a little bit easier to see, I'm going to incorporate some show footer row in here. So the show footer row option, I'm going to click on sum. That way we see what the sum is at the bottom of the table. Okay, so bits sent, again, we're going to focus on that. We have a total sum for the column of 44.29 gigabits per second. So now each value inside this table column, when we look at the bar gauge, we have this very small percentage, 9.005% of the column sum. If I go to the next one, 10.104, 10.141, and so on. If we were to take all of these percentages across all 10 of these cells in the bits sent column, we should get 100%. If we were to sum up all of the values in the bits sent column, we should get 44.29 gigabits per second. So the way these bar gauges are being shaded is it's showing the proportion in a bar gauge relative to the total sum. And that's why that looks different. So this can be useful to kind of act like a pie chart. if you think about how a pie chart looks, it shows sectors of a pie or a donut. Epix has this widget built in already. There's also the RME pie chart, which has a few extra features that you'll see in a different video. But this is just showing those proportions just in a bar gauge form and not as slices of a pie. So hopefully that makes sense to you. I really like this feature because it gives you a quick way to get both the raw metric data and percentages for whatever the use case might be. Okay, so that's the column per pattern layout. Real quick, let's talk about bar gauge layout row inside the column per pattern. I'm going to switch this back to bar gauge tooltip max and bar gauge layout. Right now we're on column. So if bar gauge layout column shows us the proportions of each cell relative to other cells in that table column, so again, bits sent, then bar gauge layout row shows the proportions within the table row. So I'm just going to highlight this row right here. That way you can see which one we're talking about. Now the bar gauge shading is relative to the maximum of the row. And there's a couple of things that are a little bit confusing in here because we have 4 different patterns. What we actually want to do is set the shading to be calculated on the interface status. And the reason for that is, the reason that interface status is fully shaded is because we set a specific control in it. We set min and max of 0 and 1. So that static max value is going to overwrite the calculated max value for another item pattern. And for bits received and bits sent, we have it set to calculated. So just to fix that small visual glitch, this is not a bug, this is just how things work in the table, and it gives you a lot of different flexibility. That's how I see it. But I'm going to set the interface status column back to a min of 0 and max of calculated. Okay, so now the bar gauges are shaded proportionately to the max value for each row. And if we focus on, I think, yeah, this one that I'm on right now is pretty good. So our max value for the row, all these are numeric values. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to compare bits received, bits sent to output discards and interface status because a discard is going to be a packet and not a bit. An interface status has no relation whatsoever to data rates going through an interface. But just for the purpose of the demo, and I'll explain it a little bit more in detail here in case this is confusing. Now if we hover over the bar gauge using, again, bar gauge layout row with max, it says 100% of row max for bits received for this table row that I've highlighted. If we go over to the next column where we have 4.45 gigabits per second, well, what do you think this bar gauge is going to tell us? Exactly. It's going to show us what percentage this is of the max value, and it's going to shade the bar gauge accordingly. If we get over to output discards, you can see there's practically no shading here because 2 out of, this is like 4 billion, I think, is such a small number that the shading is just non-existent, and then the same thing for the value of 1 relative to the max. Now, if we do bar gauge tooltip sum instead of max, what you're going to see is this cell's bar gauge and this cell's bar gauge in the same, in the same row. They're basically going to be about halved. Okay, it's going to cut them in half because what it's then doing is summing up all 4 values in this table row, computing a sum, and then determining how to shade the bar gauges based on that total sum. So I'll go ahead and click bar gauge tooltip sum, And that's exactly what we see. This is about 50% of the row sum. This is almost 50% of the row sum. This is not a good use case, but let's think about another use case. So I have this little web diagram tool, and I've preset it with a couple of rectangles that we're just going to represent as blank slates of a bar gauge. So imagine this is a table row, and we have 3 values, and I'm not going to type in the values here, but I kind of want to show you what I mean. So let's say that this first one, and I'm going to shade it green. Let's just say that this is like, let's say you have a finance processing application, and it reads in a bunch of finance data very quickly, and then it moves it off into some kind of queue for further document processing or databasing, whatever it is. But this thing is pulling in packets from some sort of like, the stock market, exchange, whatever it might be. So if we read in 100%, we'll shade in the entire bar gauge. But let's say that our next metric is how much was written. So if I were to take how much is written, maybe it is some portion of the total, right? So maybe this is about 66% of the total of this green bar, and this is how much was written. So the difference then is probably how much was dropped, like how many financial records or packets or whatever it might be could not be read, so these were dropped. So what you could see in a table where you have the bar gauge tooltip set to max, you could see something kind of like this, all right? And this actually gives you a lot of information. It shows like, okay, on this one that's shaded red, we've dropped a significant portion. And if you were to hover over it, not so much in this program, but over here, you would get the percentage, so you could very quickly see, oh, I have, I don't know, this is maybe 2 gigabits per second drops, and this is 3 gigabits per second written, and this is 5 gigabits per second in. Those numbers are very easy to calculate, but in the case of numbers like this, where you have 4.56 gigabits and 3.16 gigabits and 1 point whatever gigabits per second dropped, well, then you have to start thinking a little bit harder on how to calculate what the percentages would be. So that's where these percentages can kind of come in handy, okay? So that pretty much describes all the features of the bar gauge. We can go into the 3-column and vertical and horizontal layout real quick just to cover them. So if I click on 3-column, the only option to you is to, it's always going to default to bar gauge layout of column, regardless if you choose row. And the reason for that is there is only ever one value column inside the 3-column layout over here on the far right. So having a bar gauge layout where we compare table rows to each other is just not a thing inside the 3-column layout. So it does not matter if you choose row, okay? It's still just going to default to the column layout. And maybe it's a good idea for me to disable this button when you choose 3-column. I can look into doing that. That shouldn't be too terribly difficult. But bar gauge tooltip still applies in this instance. So if I hover over this, 10.78% of column sum, 10.61, 10.25. If I change it to max for the bar gauge tooltip, then we have 100. The value at the top is 100% of the column max, as expected. The value at the bottom is the smallest, 89.047%. This value is of the top value. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and that's relatively straightforward. Now, if we get into the vertical layout, which is adapted from the top items widget from Zabbix, you're going to have the option to choose between column or row. So typically the way that the Zabbix top items widget works is they automatically default to the row layout option. so it can show you, again, because top items is supposed to be comparing similar item values across many hosts. So in the vertical layout, our values go horizontally across the table, right? So all these values in this first row, those bar gauges are being compared to each other, okay? And then in the next table row, same thing. This one, there we go. This table row, all of these values are being compared to each other and the bar gauges are being shaded accordingly. So that's the default value that you get from the Zabbix Top Items widget, but I've given you the option to choose if you want to change that inside the widget configurations. So you can change it to column. Not really a good use case in this particular instance because, again, now we're comparing bits received, bits sent, interface output discards, and the interface status in the table column, and that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then you'll also notice in the table footer, it's kind of unrelated here, when you mix units like this, and you get this raw number instead of a unit-based metric. Okay, so, and then if we go horizontal, it's basically just the opposite of vertical. The hosts are going to be on the left side, and then the items are on the top. And the default layout that comes from Zabbix is column for bar gauge layout, and the proportions are shown within the table column for the bar gauges. Again, you can switch this over to row if you want to do that. There could be a use case for this. If you guys ever have use cases, I think it would be very interesting to start some like discussion forums on the GitHub page or maybe somewhere else where we can talk about this kind of stuff. Maybe the Zabbix company has something that they're going to come up with. I know we already have the blogs and everything, but use cases are always welcomed, I think, by the community. I just don't want to make a 1 to 2 hour long video on all the possible use cases that we could come up with. Instead, I just want to show you the features that are available. Okay, so that pretty much covers all the layouts and the basic functionality. The last thing that I want to talk about is the behavior of the bar gauges when you are sorting and filtering. So if you didn't already know, every table column now has the ability to be filtered. So you can filter all the values inside each column. And that's just by clicking on any of these funnel icons, which you hover over, it gives you a tooltip. So I'm going to focus on output discards, and I'm going to click on this funnel. Okay, and what you see here is 7 is our max value. Okay, and the bar gauge is fully shaded. Well, if I were to filter for values that are less than, let's say, less than 5, okay? So now this should give us all the zeros, the 1s, and the 2s. What you're going to end up seeing is a recalculation of the bar gauge shading, okay? So if I hit apply, now the cells that have the 2 in them are fully shaded because now they are the maximum value for the column. So that's how the filtering works with the bar gauges, and it's just a way to show you what the percentage is of the now filtered values in the table after applying filtering. And this works on multiple levels, right? So if I go over to the left column, the bits sent, and I were to just filter for this 4.12 gigabits per second number, which in order to get that, if I hover over 4120522, 4120522, it's this first one right here. So what you're going to see is a couple of things happen. So right now, 4.12 is 82.965% of the column max, and its corresponding cell to the right in output discards is 50% of the column max. Well, if I filter for this value, okay, you're going to see both bar gauges, all bar gauges get recalculated regardless of where the filter is applied. So now, and we now have one single table row, so every bar gauge is maximally filled out. So, but I just wanted to explain to you that when you apply these client-side filters, what's happening here. So I'm going to clear those. I'm going to clear this one. And if I clear all the filters, now it goes back to what it looked like at the beginning. So again, a lot of cool features. I really enjoyed making this one, so I hope you guys get some good use out of it, and look forward to the next video.